much, the member for Hinkler. Now give the call to the member for Hotham.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Throughout our history, New Zealanders have shown a great deal of generosity in sharing their cultural icons, achievements and creations with us Aussies. Some might even suggest that we've shown a willingness to appropriate these things. But whatever the intention, whether it's Crowded House in Canberra or Weet-Bix and Pavlova, New Zealanders have shown a willingness to share their culture with their friends across the ditch. Unfortunately, Speaker, the strong friendship which underlies our dealings with New Zealanders is today not reflected in the manner in which Australia treats New Zealanders living in our country. Policy changes made primarily by the Howard government have created significant injustices for New Zealanders living in Australia, and I believe that some of them need to be corrected. Speaker, policy that reflects the long history of close friendship between our two countries allows New Zealanders and Australians to cross the Tasman freely. When Australians go to New Zealand, they're access to something that's very close to citizenship rights, but the reverse does not apply to New Zealanders who come to live in Australia. Speaker, changes made by the Howard government have created a lottery system for New Zealanders, where those who happen to be in Australia on certain dates have something close to citizenship rights, whereas other New Zealanders, some of whom have now lived here for decades, have no such rights. The stripping away of rights for New Zealanders is unfair on its own, but it's also created some really terrible human rights consequences. For New Zealander women who are caught in this visa trap, who are in domestic violence relationships, it can be a lot harder for them to access housing and other supports. For women in those situations who have Australian children, the situation is even worse. They can't go home because their kids are Australians. They're not able to get the services they need, and many of them are unable to support themselves here in Australia, leaving some very unpalatable options available to them. Another injustice, Deputy Speaker, is for New Zealanders living in Australia with disability. For children who are in Australian schools, they can currently access disability support, but they will not be eligible for the NDIS, Deputy Speaker, and this will mean that those young people actually see a reduction in their support that's required to help them deal with their disability. Speaker, HECS changes are another major issue. For New Zealanders living in Australia, they are not allowed to access our HECS system, and that means for people who may have lived in this country for decades, they're trapped in low-skilled jobs and unable to make that investment that they need to get the skills that are required to operate in a modern economy. We welcome the government's decision to finally try to correct this situation by allowing HECS legislation that was put forward by Senator Carr in the other place to take priority. But, Deputy Speaker, I want the government to go further and consider what rights we should allow New Zealanders living in Australia. We shouldn't leave our friends across the ditch living in Australia in limbo. That's simply unfair and doesn't reflect the strong cultural and friendship connections that we have with our friends across the Tasman.
Thanks very much, the member for